Next up, we have a lecture titled Identity Was Never Yours by Siri Landgren. Siri uses she, they pronouns and is an artist and writer based in Gothenburg, Sweden. Originally trained as a composer and sound artist, her work is now largely text-based, whether performed, printed, or installed. Subjectivity and the self-care recurring themes, are recurring themes in the series' work, with an eye to the materiality of the text and the fleshly origins of cognition. In her presentation, Siri will show us how identity, despite its changing guises, has always been located outside our choice and agency. The presentation is based on the essay Identiteten har aldrig varit din, which Siri wrote in Socialpolitik earlier this year. If you have any experiences that you would like to share anonymously that relate to this topic, there is a QR code on all of the program papers that are on the table. You can share them anonymously, and this is the opportunity for Siri to feature them in a future article of hers. So without further ado, I welcome Siri on stage.
Thank you, and thank you to the speakers on the previous panel. It's so great that you have this space like last year to talk about this experience, especially of racialization. And I think it was interesting how that panel touched on something that I'll be talking about, how healthcare comes to be about so much other than just the treatments we need and our problems. So that's what I'll be talking about. My name is, like you heard, Siri Landgren. And this is based on this essay, Identiteten har aldrig varit din, which dealt with the concept of identity in a few different ways, because identity has been held as our concept, as something belonging maybe perhaps most of all to the trans community as our way of being ourselves and authentic. But there are some truths behind the concept of identity that it didn't really originate with us in the sense that it is used in this context today, especially when it comes to trans healthcare. So that's specifically the part of this essay that I will be talking about today. And I will be talking about how things are in Sweden, but the patterns surrounding this are of course similar in many countries. And I will be talking about the gender assessment diagnostic teams in Sweden. And I know that there are decent people working there. And I also know that not all of us have a proper view of exactly how things work there, because things aren't codified in laws or written down regulations, but there are lots of kinds of informal practice that regulate how the procedure takes place. But this is going to deal with largely how the system for diagnostication in Sweden works, and how we have to deal with that. So let me start with some testimonials that I gathered. I had this online survey where you could talk about experiences of having felt that you couldn't be honest with your assessment team or lying. And I've chosen some specifically about the concept of identity. So this is going to set kind of a context for what I'm going to be talking about. So one respondent said, "I used to be certain I was a guy, but I recently started to realize how complex gender is and that I'm probably non-binary. Either way, I'd like to microdose testo or just be on it for a while to get a more androgynous effect. However, I've heard that my assessment team doesn't treat non-binary people, so I will probably lie. It doesn't feel very good. I'm afraid that I'll be counted as a detransitioner, which I'm not." Another respondent said, "Since it's not valid, according to the current system, to be non-binary and have bottom dysphoria, I've lied and told them I was binary. Since trans healthcare is lifelong, I'll have to keep maintaining my story in order to not lose my right to healthcare by being too honest. I take testo, have done a mastectomy, want a penis, etc., but I'm not strictly a man. I just am. I'm me. I haven't told my assessment psychologist this, not because I think she'd have thought it mattered, but because I'm worried I won't get the healthcare I need/want, like testo, bottom surgery, etc. So this is going to be about what I've called identity theater, how the way that the healthcare system concerning trans treatments is set up, and what this does to the concept of identity. So first, a few things about the concept of identity in this sense. And like I said, this is kind of being held as our concept in a lot of ways, but it really, the term gender identity or core gender identity was really coined by psychiatrist Robert Stoller, and I'm pretty sure this was in the 50s. And he did this in order to give treatment to some trans people. But the concept of identity was really invented to explain transness as an anomaly, because these desires simply to have treatment or live as something other than your assigned gender were incomprehensible. So this is really something that was applied to us from outside in order to validate us in an existing cis-normative system. And this concept, he had some different attempts at basing it in. He worked with basing it in biology and also in psychoanalysis, and connecting it to childhood trauma and things like that. But the central point is that, according to Stoller, somewhere in the individual there is a truth about their gender. And you might not be able to see it from the surface because some people appear as one gender, like the one they're assigned, but are really somehow another gender. So in this sense, this is an essentialist concept. There is an essence somewhere inside you which is permanent and cannot be changed. And interestingly, this has quite a few similarities with, for example, chromosomal gender, where also you have something in your body that dictates your gender, that lies hidden, permeates your whole person. You can't localize it to a specific point, and it's impossible to change. So in one sense, this isn't very different from gender based on chromosomes. And this, of course, leads to how this really ties in so well to the born this way concept, that this is something included in our bodies, even if it's not visible to the outside world, or maybe even to ourselves, but that we're born with. And for me, it's really interesting that the moment of birth is given this very specific significance, that this is like a snapshot of the correct state of this person. I, for example, was born with a broken collarbone. So in this sense, identity can be expressed, which was something that was really a big thing in the 1900s, how we, all the songs about express yourself, but we cannot choose it. And now I have to drink some water. And I just want to give you an interesting quote from Patricia Gerovici, who's a psychoanalyst. And this book, Transgender Psychoanalysis, is not perfect. I have some issues with it, but it has some interesting points, specifically around the history of the concept of identity in psychiatry and specifically psychoanalysis. So she talks about some earlier concepts of gender and sexuality, which are here kind of mixed, hence the word bisexuality, which is kind of referring both to gender and sexuality here. She says, despite its obvious limitations, the biological position on bisexuality held by Hirschfeld, Ulrich, Steinach, or Benjamin appears closer to a queer notion of sexuality because it proposes that genders evolve as a continuum rather than being defined by a strict binary. Paradoxically, it is the liberal discourse of gender identity that supports a sort of essentialism about gender identification. So to move to healthcare, why do we seek assessment and a possible diagnosis for gender dysphoria or transsexualism, as it is still called, I think, in the ICD? We might do it to explore this identity thing, explore who we are. That is something that the assessment teams claim to offer. and that they encourage us to do there. But the interesting thing is that this is the one thing that we can do anywhere we like. We can do it here, we can do it by ourselves, with our friends, our lovers. So this is a thing we definitely don't specifically need, most of us specifically need an assessment team to do. We might seek a diagnosis to get subsidized interventions. And I'm using the word interventions because I'm kind of dubious about calling this healthcare in all instances. You can ask me later about that. Things like that are available on the open market, like voice training or hair removal, which cis people might also be interested in getting. And also things that are available, like top surgery is freely available if you're of legal age and have a lot of money. So this you can get subsidized if you have a diagnosis. But there are also interventions that you can only get in Sweden right now with one of the transgender diagnoses or dysphoria diagnoses. This includes hormones, which, as far as I'm aware, according to the new law about nationell högspecialiserad vård, only the assessment teams can grant the diagnosis for this. Correct me if I'm wrong. Bottom surgery, where you need permission from Socialstyrelsen, from Rättsliga rådet, in contrast with top surgery. So that's interesting. There's a double validation process needed, both the diagnosis and then the acceptance of this råd. And until July next year, to change your legal gender, you need a diagnosis, unlike all the other Nordic countries, for example. So the primary function to most of us of these assessment teams are as gatekeepers, specifically to these last treatments. They're our only way of accessing those. So the categories that they labor with, and here I think it's interesting to think about the concept of gender or genus in Swedish as having an older meaning of simply meaning kind, how something is created. And like in language, you have grammatical gender, which isn't always about anything social or biological. So the identities that are kind of recognized in these processes, you can be cis, you can be non-binary or binary trans. These are the major categories that they labor with. This is what we need to find out during the assessment process. And these correspond to different diagnoses, like the outcomes. This is like the main crutch of the whole process. What diagnosis do you get? You can get no diagnosis. You can get, these are codes from ICD-10, F64.8, which is in Swedish is called andra specificerade könsidentitetsstörningar, or F64.0, transsexualism, as it is still called in the ICD. And as a following from this, you can get different treatments offered. If you get no diagnosis, you get offered no treatment. If you get the F64.8 diagnosis, you get access to a smaller set of treatment options. You can get hormones, for example. I think hair removal and voice training are included. But if you get the F64.0 or the so-called transsexualism diagnosis, you get access to the whole package of treatment options, including bottom surgery, hysterectomy, and changing your legal gender. And to back this up about how things actually work, I asked Edvard Summanen, who works at Transammans, who I assume to be one of the most knowledgeable people in Sweden about this, in an email. And he said, it's usually the case that binary trans people are diagnosed with 64.0 and non-binary with F64.8. But there are, of course, exceptions. Some non-binary people get F64.0 if they need the treatment associated with it. But it varies between different assessment teams. I've also heard that openly non-binary adults are refused hormone treatments by some teams, despite Socialstyrelsens guidelines, and non-binary minors get very limited treatment from most teams. So largely we have this system, where you have an identity that is established through the assessment process. The identity corresponds to what diagnosis you get, and the diagnosis then determines what treatment you are offered. If you're cis, or if the assessment process finds that you are cis or not trans, you get no diagnosis and offered no treatment, which might be good for you, or you might not have been listened to enough. If you're judged to be non-binary, you, in the most cases, get F64.8 and are offered the smaller set of treatment options. And if you're binary, you get the jackpot, the gold standard, the transsexualism diagnosis, and offered all the treatment options if you want them. So for the person seeking aid, if you come to the assessment teams wanting something specific, this is how the process will turn out for you. You have to think about, what interventions do I want? Second, which diagnosis is required to get the interventions I want? And third, to present a suitable identity to your assessment team to get that diagnosis. And presenting as binary trans is always the safest bet, because you get access to the largest set of treatment options. So the chart is, for us, flipped. We start with the treatments. What do I want? If we're strategic, if we really want something. And then you proceed to what diagnosis you can settle for. And lastly, what identity you have to present. And the consequences of this, well, this, of course, leads to a lot of misery, pain, and confusion. So let me read some more testimonials. I identify as non-binary transmasculine, but tell my assessment team that I identify as a trans man in order to get the aid I need, a hysterectomy and a change of legal gender. During my assessment, this made me feel like I lost touch with myself, since I focused hard on playing a role. Presenting a half-truth about my identity made me severely ashamed and confused. I felt like my non-binary identity was no longer valid. It ruined years of hard work, building up a sense of having a right to exist as non-binary. I felt forced to adapt the assessment team's version of manhood and masculinity, and I now know I've been harmed by this, having to make myself perform a hyper-masculinity that I'm not sure how to get let go of, to let other parts of me coexist. And how do we do better? Well, we listened to this conference. First of all, this is one of the most hope-inspiring events in Sweden for me right now. And we work toward a system based not on identity, but on wants, needs, and desires, something that allows for exploration and uncertainty. And I want to take the opportunity to plug a little pamphlet that I wrote, which is kind of related to this. This is in Swedish, called Alietet, about this concept that I'm reviving from the dustbin of history. In English, it would be aliety. And this is, I claim, the opposite of identity. This is thinking of yourself not in terms of what you're identical to or similar to, but how you're different, what you're different from. So I have some of these with me. You can buy it, 100 kronor. Come find me afterwards. And I want to end with an inspiring quote from one of my favorite authors, Andrea Longchu, from an essay called On Liking Women. And this reinforces my fantasy about what the process should be like. She says, I doubt that any of us transition simply because we want to be women in some sort of some abstract academic way. I certainly didn't. I transitioned for gossip and compliments, lipstick and mascara, for crying at the movies, for being someone's girlfriend, for letting her pay the check or carrying my bags, for the benevolent chauvinism of bank tellers and cable guys, for the telephonic intimacy of long-distance female friendship, for fixing my makeup in the bathroom flanked like Christ by a sinner on each side, for sex toys, for feeling hot, for getting hit on by butches, for that secret knowledge of which dykes to watch out for Daisy Dukes, bikini tops, and all the dresses, and my God, for the breasts. Thank you.